perhaps not so much that you become sleepy and unable to follow this last session of the forum, which is going to focus on how we can encourage responsible investors in the Mekong region. Now, before we start the session, I'd like to remind you again about the poll in case you hadn't yet cast your vote. You can find the link to the poll in the chat box. Now, some of you may remember that Louisa cited some really striking figures around land investment in Asia during the opening remarks yesterday morning. She said that Asia saw investments of around $370 billion, 5 times more than Africa saw and way higher than Latin America as well. And I think those numbers just highlighted the importance of ensuring that such investments are done responsibly. Well, our first speaker for this plenary session is Dr. Jana Harold from the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Now, she'll be taking us through the ASEAN Guidelines for Responsible Agriculture Investment in Food, Agriculture and Forestry, which were adopted across the region in 2018. Jana, and before Jana starts, may I just ask those who have not switched off their microphones to please do so. Jana, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim, for this introduction. Let me share my screen with you. And in case you are not seeing my slides, please let me know. So thanks again for this opportunity and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Jana Harold. I'm an associate professional officer at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations at headquarters. So I'm joining you from Rome today. The work of the Responsible Agriculture Investments team at FAO overall focuses on supporting the application of global and regional guiding instruments on responsible investments on agriculture and food systems, both at the regional and country level, and we work with government and non-government actors to enhance responsible agricultural investments. So today I'm going to talk not only about the importance of agricultural investments for a sustainable and inclusive development in the Mekong region, but more specifically how the ASEAN guidelines on promoting responsible investment in food, agriculture and forestry, in short the ASEAN RAI guidelines, how they, as a regional guiding instrument, provide a roadmap to make this a reality, as well as the role that tenure and forestry play in these guidelines. And it is important to note that the idea of these guidelines is not to introduce a new concept, but rather they can be seen as a tool that brings current initiatives and standards together and provides regional guidance to an existing landscape of standards. And also applying these ASEAN RAI guidelines is not a simple top-down process. So while governments are key in applying the ASEAN RAI by aligning their national policies to this regionally approved framework, the private sector and civil society also play an important role to make responsible agricultural investments a reality in the Mekong region. So we know that ASEAN is home to a large number of agribusinesses and forestry companies making agriculture, including forestry and fisheries, an important sector for investment in ASEAN, and it contributes to more than 11% to ASEAN's regional GDP, with even higher contributions in the individual Mekong countries where the sector employs a significant share of the population. We also know that investing in agriculture is one of the most effective strategies to reduce hunger and poverty and generate economic growth, and that we need to increase investment in the sector to contribute to a sustainable development. But not all investments are good. Investments that are not responsible can have severe negative impacts on all the stakeholders, local communities, but also the investors. So it is not about increasing agricultural investments per se, but to increase their quality. And with this in mind, and also responding to an increase in intra-ASEAN foreign direct investment in the agri and forestry sectors in recent years, the ASEAN RAI guidelines were developed through a multi-stakeholder process, and the ASEAN member states adopted them in 2018. They are grounded in the principles of responsible investment in agriculture and food systems by the Committee on World Food Security, the CFS-RAI, and they represent the ASEAN RAI guidelines. They represent the first adoption of these global CFS-RAI guideline principles in a regional instrument. And FAO Croatia, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and the ASEAN Secretariat are also partnering to support the ASEAN member states to implement these guidelines, working with governments, the private sector, and the civil society under a project funded by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, SDC. So in a nutshell, the ASEAN RAI seek to attract responsible investment through a coherent regional approach with clear national policy frameworks by balancing the rights and interests of all the stakeholders involved. The ASEAN RAI provide a framework to guide the ASEAN member states and investors in the development of responsible and sustainable investment and value chains. They establish a reference for decisions, behaviors, and actions in ASEAN over the mid to long term. And it is also important to note that the guidelines are voluntary in nature and do not conflict with existing national laws or regulations or with binding international treaties. So the ASEAN RAI consists of 10 guidelines or thematic areas, and they are adapted to the specific characteristics of the region. So for instance, they highlight the importance of forests or also the relevance of regional approaches. And in the following, I will focus on the 2 guidelines addressing the issue of tenure and forests. So guideline 4 is about tenure of land, fisheries, and forests, and access to water. And to follow this guideline, a responsible investment should respect all legitimate tenure rights holders in line with international instruments. These include the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests, the VGGT, the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries, the SSF guidelines, and in the case of indigenous peoples, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Responsible investment should also recognize the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities to free, prior, and informed consent ethic. It should also respect tenure by assessing the social impacts of investment activities on all legitimate tenure rights holders, as well as avoid displacement and resettlement. Guideline 5 emphasizes the importance of conserving and sustainably managing natural resources, and in particular ASEAN's forests, as this is a very important subsector for investments in the region. So by applying this guideline, a responsible investment should avoid or minimize any negative impacts on natural resources. It should support sustainable forest management practices, including the recognition of forest economic, social, cultural, and ecological value, and the contribution to biodiversity. A responsible investment should also balance economic objectives and the needs to increase production with conservation objectives and the needs of local communities and indigenous people. It should also support sustainable sourcing, increase production efficiency, encourage sustainable consumption, and ensure robust participatory planning, management, and governance of natural resources. So there are a lot of important aspects that an agricultural investment should take into account in relation to tenure and to forestry in order to be aligned with the ASEAN RAI guidelines. And some of these aspects are already taken into account in different voluntary sustainability standards and certifications that exist. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the purpose of the ASEAN RAI is not to introduce a new concept, but to put in place a clear policy framework and a coherent regional approach, and thereby providing regionally specific guidance to this existing landscape of standards. So the ASEAN RAI brings existing initiatives and standards, like for instance FPIC, into one regional framework. And the recent mapping report by Croatia also assessed how a number of existing industry and investment standards and principles align with the ASEAN RAI. And you can see an excerpt of this mapping in the figure on the right-hand side. And this report found that agribusiness and financial investors who are certified or signatories to many of the standards that were reviewed in this mapping, they are already aligned with the ASEAN RAI to a certain extent. So showing that they are complementary and not totally different concepts or ideas, but overlap. And if you like to compare a company's sustainability commitments to the ASEAN RAI, you can also do so on the International Trade Center's standards map, which allows companies to compare their existing sustainability commitments to over 300 other certifications, codes of conduct, and audit protocols. And the ASEAN RAI guidelines are now part of this map. So summing up, the ASEAN RAI guidelines are a tool to help support policy makers in enabling and enhancing responsible agricultural investments. But they provide not only a roadmap to governments, but investors and civil society also play a key role. And a key aspect is the need for governments to create a level playing field with national legal and policy frameworks that privilege responsible investors, and that is promoting a race to the top. And as we've seen on the previous slide, there are already existing standards that contribute to applying the ASEAN RAI, but they are not yet sufficient. So that means that for the private sector, aligning their investment practices to the ASEAN RAI does not only help them to mitigate commercial, financial, reputational risks, but ultimately it will also help them in being prepared for a new landscape, a new policy landscape in which responsible investment practices will be required for license to operate. And finally, it is also key to raise awareness and strengthen capacities of civil societies and local communities to enable their meaningful participation in investment processes. So governments are key in laying the foundation and creating an enabling environment for responsible investment, but to make this a reality in the ASEAN region, it is a joint effort of all the stakeholders involved. And I will stop here with this introduction to the ASEAN RAI guidelines. If you like to learn more about FAO's work on responsible agricultural investments, you can follow the website or follow our Twitter account. And also, if you'd like to learn more about the SDC-funded project that supports the application of the ASEAN RAI guidelines, our project partner IASD will host a breakout session after this plenary session on the ASEAN RAI alignment assessment tool. So it's a tool that allows ASEAN member states to assess the extent to which their institutional, legal, and policy framework align with the ASEAN RAI. And Croatia will host a breakout session on case studies that they conducted on agricultural investment in the region and the constraints that companies face. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jana, for the introduction to the ASEAN RAI guidelines and, of course, how they can help not just policymakers, but investors and the civil society. We now have two speakers from Vietnam Rubber Group, Mr. Diap Song Chong and Dr. Chanti Doi Hua, who is going to be explaining how some of these principles are being applied in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Now, Mr. Chong will be the main presenter, but Dr. Hua will join the Q&A.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Diệp Xuân Trường, member of Steering Committee for Sustainable Rubber Development in Vietnam Rubber Group, VRG. Today, on behalf of VRG, I will present the topic on toward more responsible rubber in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Next, please. Thank you. Let's start with the production of VRG in 2020. VRG currently has 5 main business fields: natural rubber, rubber production, wood processing, industrial park, and high-tech agricultural. Regarding to natural rubber, VRG had a rubber area of 400 to 1,650 hectares in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And with a rubber product, we produce close conventional belts time. Our total product of rubber wood is about 1.3 million cubic meter per year. VRG is currently investing in 11 industrial parks with a total area about 6,000 hectares. Besides, we are implementing a number of high-tech agricultural projects with some main products like tissue, cultural, banana, fruit tree. We have about 83,000 workers, which eventually income 7.6 million Vietnam dong per worker per month. Next, please. From the slide, you can see the Sustainable Development Program of VRG from 2019 to 2024, and we identify sustainable development of the VRG key policy. Economic development must be associated with social responsibility and environmental protection. VRG sustainable development is associated with a country sustainable development and international commitment signed by Vietnam. And so environmentally friendly production and rise the corporate social responsibility and support local community. Next slide, please. VRG promotes sustainable development and responsible investment and focus on the following main topic: developing the VRG plan through sustainable development, responsible production, investment, ensuring compliance with national law, respecting the international commitment signed by Vietnam and host country, implement the Sustainable Development Program in 2019 and 2020, in which managed 150,000 hectares of rubber according to Vietnam certification system, VFCS, 23,400 hectares of rubber plantation, and 23 factories are certified under VFCS and international certification of BFC. Continue to development activity to the end this association with FSC to implement environment protection. VRG had 24 companies applying ISO 14001 and 7 companies use rooftop solar power. VRG is planning the cooperation for sustainable development with BFC, RNIBC, Odd Farm, Nature. VRG aims to become a leading company in natural rubber production in Vietnam, conduct farming with farmers, implement forest sustainable management certification, research for technology supporting rubber product activity of large and small expansion in Vietnam to keep high level in the world, implement social security investment in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Next slide, please. On this slide, we would like to show our activity to support natural rubber consumption for smallholder through the purchasing a smallholder rubber with a transparent market price announcement on the website. We also cooperate with other relevant organizations to promote the consumption linkage for rubber smallholder output. Next slide, please. And this slide, there are some pictures of our social security investment in Laos and Cambodia, such as temple, medical station, roads, electricity system, have for worker and school. Next, please. PAC always strengthen the community engagement with a local authority and community, also with NGO. Next, please. Our sustainable development and responsible investment are implemented based on the guidance of government in laws and legal documents. Particularly, we have the cooperation with administration of forestry to promote sustainable forest management plan and implementing forest certification according to national and international standards. We also receive the support of the development organization NGO to raise the awareness and guidance through practical tools such as voluntary guidelines on mitigating social environmental risks in the cultural in the Mekong reserve, Mekong sub-region with farm manager, technical manual for sustainable rubber production, UNS Vietnam, handbook for community engagement refer to EPIC with farm Vietnam and farm Cambodia, guidance to for sustainable rubber plantation management according to international standard, sponsored by WWF Vietnam, to promote sustainable development and responsible investment more efficiently in the future. We have some suggestions as follows. Increase investment to improve infrastructure in the rural area and rubber project area in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Promote the assurance of land use right certificate for farmer and business. Government development organization NGO continue to support PAC to implement sustainable development and responsible investment, including certification, I&D, extension service, and vocational training, establishment of the association, cooperative contract production to bring benefit to the community and economic efficiency to enterprise. Next, please. I have present about PAC toward more responsible rubber in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Chong, for your presentation. It was really interesting to see what VRC is doing. Now, for our third and last presentation, we have two speakers from the Mekong timber plantations, which is jointly owned by New Forest and the government of Laos. Mr. Justin Mercer and Mr. Nico Stridon will be giving us the perspectives from the timber sector in Laos PDR.
Thank you for the introduction. So my name is Justin Mercer. I'm the Environmental and Social Manager for New Forest Asia. And New Forest Asia is a company located in Singapore, and we're under the umbrella of the greater New Forests, which is a global enterprise. Sorry, if you can skip to slide 3, that'd be great. And apologies, I may have to move through fairly quickly to stay within a reasonable time frame here. So New Forests was founded in 2005, and we offer institutional investors with targeted opportunities in the Asia Pacific region and the United States, having approximately 6 billion Australian dollars in assets under management globally. And our assets include sustainable timber plantations, rural land, and conservation investments, related to ecosystem restoration and carbon sequestration. We currently have approximately 1 million hectares of land and conservation investments, and we're headquartered in Sydney with offices in San Francisco, Singapore, and New Zealand. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that I work in the Singapore office. So New Forests Asia focuses primarily on Southeast Asian investments. We are currently managing what we call the Tropical Asia Forest Fund, or we call it TAF. I'll probably call it TAF for the rest of this. So we recognize that the tropical Southeast Asia is an emerging market for sustainable plantation forestry investments by institutional investors. So our Southeast Asian strategy focuses on certified plantations with a rigorous approach to environmental and social values and good governance. We currently have 3 assets under management: Mekong Timber Plantations, which is approximately 24,000 hectare eucalypt plantation with some remnant acacia from the previous ownership, and that's in central Lao PDR. Acacia Forest Industry, which is an approximately 25,000 hectare concession in Malaysia, and Hutan Katapang Industry, or HKI, an approximately 100,000 hectare concession with rubber plantation in Indonesia, for which we're actually a minority owner in. Next slide, please. So looking forward, New Forests Asia is actually implementing a new model. So we will have a TAF2, and future investments are looking to have sort of a blended finance model. And what that means essentially is that a significant portion of the investment capital will be specifically allocated toward carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and community livelihoods impact activities. And so what that means is we'll have significant capital to implement these impact activities and programs that extend well beyond what we call the business as usual model. So I'll go on to explain what New Forests Asia's business as usual model is. But we see this as a really exciting way of promoting environmental and social sustainability in the plantations forestry sector. Really, by providing capital, I'll give you an example. In the context of biodiversity management, this is going to mean the difference between a conservation project and an advanced restoration project. Again, this will extend to carbon and livelihoods and biodiversities, but we see that each of these projects are essentially will provide these co-benefits across that spectrum. Next slide, please. So I'll skip through this rather quickly. My intent is not to point to all of our policies. I think as an investment manager, it's critical that we have very strong and clear policies in place. So as a former field scientist, the need for strong policies wasn't entirely clear to me as I was implementing projects. But as part of an investment management team, I found this to be critical. basically, what New Forest wants and expects out of its assets that are managed need to be really clearly filtered down to the portfolio operations. So the general manager, obviously has a wide range of responsibilities, wide range of departments, and of course needs to meet productivity demands and expectations. So Nico, for example, who will be speaking after me at MTP, needs to be provided those clear New Forest requirements and expectations for ESG, environmental, social, and governance, to ensure that we're aligned. And then it's his job and his sustainability department's job, and often independent consultants' job, to develop the standard operating procedures, the training manuals and sessions, the monitoring reports, and et cetera, and the many things that go into an environmental social management program like this. That said, we do collaborate considerably, and really to take advantage of collective experience. Next slide, please. So, quickly, so for the TAF2 and really for TAF, these are really some of the pillars of our environmental and social policy. And, for the sake of brevity, this is really simplified, but, the top two are our critical sort of standards and guidelines. Our assets are all required. Forest certification is required for all of our assets. At this time, that's Forest Stewardship Council, FSC. But we're also open to PEFC if it makes sense in the future. And we use the IFC performance standards as also a critical compliance component for all investments. Our investments, zero deforestation is a requirement for our investments. So, we use only degraded vegetation to convert to plantations. Protecting peatlands going forward will be an important component of TAF2, given the importance, particularly in the region. And of course, respecting land tenure is a critical component of both FSC and IFC. Supply chain requirements. Right now, we will be operating a mill shortly, and we'll be looking for FSC chain of custody certification for that. And responsible investment guidelines is really just to point out that we have a flexible approach to our policy, meaning that we need to change it. We do change it as best practices change and improve. Examples would be that going forward, we're incorporating the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests, the voluntary principles on security and human rights, and the UNDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So these are some things that became best practice and were developed after TAF was implemented, and have thus far have been sort of added to our requirements. Next slide, please. So, sorry, if we can go to the previous slide, I left out a couple of things. This thing to the right here, this figure, we have what's called the SLI, or the Sustainable Landscape Initiative. And this is around our reporting requirements to our investors. But also it's used as our tool for continual improvement. So if we're not meeting our shared prosperity performance indicators, we have a tracking system that really tells us that, and allows us really to implement an adaptive management framework and meet those expectations in future years. As Jana mentioned, there's a lot of similarities between the ASEAN RAI and the performance standards in this case, and the FSC principles and criteria. So going forward, I'll focus more on what we use, which is again the performance standards and the principles and criteria, and sort of how those align with ASEAN RAI. So next slide. let's see, sorry, previous one. I'm not sure why I have principle 6 there. That's a typo. So this is related to principle 5, clearly, around conservation and sustainable management of natural resources. So I mentioned no deforestation, which isn't on this slide, but that's obviously a critical component of FSC certification using degraded lands only. And I need to point out the fact that this figure is not mine. I've taken this from FSC's high conservation value section. So we use the high conservation values, which there's now the high conservation value resource network, or the HCVRN, that sort of dictates how this works. And we use the HCV assessment and the management plan as a key tool for both environmental and social management. I'll focus on it for the environmental side for the moment. It was developed for FSC, but has now, there's been a lot of uptake in other areas. And as you can see with this graphic, it points to the various FSC principles and criteria that it aligns to. But it clearly has, HCV 1 through 3 are environmental, and 4 through 6 more on the social side. I should say 4 is both environmental and social with the ecosystem services. But let's see, okay, so basically the combination of these 3 tools that I've pointed to here, the high conservation values, critical habitat, and the high carbon stock, are basically our key approach to determining what land is available for plantations and what will be set aside for conservation or restoration. So, the HCV is the principal tool, largely because it, critical habitat requirements are they definitely require, a higher prevalence of rare threatened species. It's really harder to reach that critical habitat threshold, which is under the performance standards. So if it's something that can logically be considered critical habitat, it will certainly fall under HCV. So the HCV is a critical tool, is the critical tool that we use for conservation set-asides. But we're now moving towards a high carbon stock approach as well. And part of this is because there's quite a lot of subjectivity into what you would call a forest, versus scrub, secondary forest, and where in that line of succession, is something called a forest. And the high carbon stock approach has determined a way of classifying forests into one of 6 classes. And so at the first 4 of which, could logically be considered forests due to the carbon stocks in them. So that sort of really helps us delineate what can be converted to plantations, what will not. And what you see here in the figure down in the bottom left is at HKI, the rubber plantation, the pink red color being the set-asides, and the clear being the land that's available for plantations. It's not all planted at this point. But HKI, for example, is approximately 50% high conservation value. So that land can't be touched. It needs to be, and it's managed according to a high conservation value management and monitoring plan. And then the remaining, there's a remaining 40 odd plus hectares when you consider roads and so forth, that is available for plantations, not all of which is planted at this time. But obviously every asset differs. At MTP, the government gave almost, a much larger proportion of it was degraded lands. So to meet FSC's requirement for 10% set aside, we basically certain plantations, certain areas that could qualify as plantations in every other respect have been set aside as conservation area to meet that criteria, whereas AFI falls somewhere in the middle. Next slide, please. Let's see, I'm cognizant of time, but here we have just sort of this really just shows the overlap of the IFC performance standards, the FSC principles and criteria with Guideline 5 for the ASEAN RAI for respecting local communities' tenure. And you know, I guess that yes.
Justin, my apologies. I don't mean to interrupt, but we are running a bit over time, and I'm conscious that Nico needs to provide some information about.
You know what? That's my mistake. I didn't keep a close enough eye on the clock. Why don't we hand it over now? This was my last slide anyway. Apologies,
okay,
Nico.
thank you. Nico, you're muted.
My apologies. Can you just jump back to the presentation that Justin did? I think it's page 10 of his slide. If you can just, I think it's page 10. That's the one, thank you. Just a quick overview on Mekong Timber Plantations. It's quite an old company in Laos. It's established 1999. TAF, the Tropical Asia Forest Fund, acquired the shares from OG in 2017, March. It's about a 24,000 hectare gross plantation. Existing is about 9,500 planted, and 7,000 hectares that should be replanted with proper stock. It basically eucalypt and some acacias all along the Mekong River, from basically Paksan down to Takek, a little bit further down into Maasai areas. The previous owners did a really good tree breeding program, of which we're getting the benefit from at the moment. The state of the asset at the time of acquisition, it was about 11,000 hectares that was fully established. They've planted more areas, but some areas has been unfortunately heavily neglected due to, I can't fully comment on the previous owner strategy, but probably funding constraints as well. The plantations were established on a variety of cover types, and unfortunately there was a conversion of some degraded natural ecosystem. The strategy for Mekong timber plantations is to convert it from a pulp into a higher value veneer and sawlog crop. Developing at the moment our own processing plant where we can add value to our own crop. Two problems we had from the legacy issues. One was the outgrower scheme that started giving major problems, and unfortunately, and then also we looking at expansion with the Lao government vision 20, I think it's called 2030 now, to go back to 70% forest cover. Next slide, please. Just on the outgrowers, the previous scheme, I think it was about 5,000 farmers with roughly 5,000 hectares. Unfortunately, there was very little communication with the farmers. There was a contract for the company to purchase the farmers wood after 7 years. Due to numerous reasons, the company couldn't purchase. The local market in Laos was non-existent. The government put on restrictions on export of logs, and there was a lot of distrust from the farmers. We worked together with IFC and NGO called Village Focus International to first understand what went wrong with the outgrowers and how to improve, obviously, and restart the program. We spent about 2 years looking at what went wrong, developing a new system, and we started to implement as from last year. We're doing it small scale, whereby we assist the farmers to ensure they've got legal right to the land, that there's no conflict on their land. Provide them with technical assistance, and the only condition is that they need to approach us first if they want to sell the timber. If we can agree on a price, we buy. If not, then they are free to sell in the open market. Next one, please. And sorry, Rob, this is my last slide. Just on the expansion area, this shows a map of Mekong timber plantations. It's 211 specific blocks, all the way from Paksam down to Takek. It includes a wide variety of land. The areas that's been made available by government includes, you can see on the list, there's a whole list of land. And I think for us, the major challenge is going to be to avoid mistakes of the past, and that the FPIC process is going to be extremely well managed. There's shifting cultivation land that was available on the map. When we go there, it's not available. It's busy recovering back into forest, or it's village land, or it's attached to customary land tenure. So we are taking it slowly with that conversion, or not conversion, the expansion process. We need to have absolute social license to operate, and our FPIC process needs to be 100% in place to make sure that that land that is being made available is available. We will obviously do full ESIA on the land, and I think that's the holdup for us, is just that the government of Laos insists only on what they call a initial impact assessment. We want to take it to the full ESIA, and we need to ensure that everybody is involved in the process before we will put any trees into new land. Thank you very much. That's from me.
Thanks so much, Justin and Nico, for your presentations, and really interesting to hear how you're emphasizing on, getting everybody involved, and also the blended finance model that you're embarking on, because, it's being touted as a key way to fund a lot of climate adaptation work in developing countries. We're now going to move on to the panel discussion and Q&A, which is going to be moderated by Rob Cole from MRLG. Now, joining Rob are James Bampton from the WWF, Stefano Savi from the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber, and Vicky Bowman from the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thanks to our plenary speakers. That really sets up our discussion quite well. I think there was a very crisp introduction from FAO on the RAI principles as applied to forest landscapes, and then 2 practical examples from the Vietnam Rubber Group and New Forests, which has already generated a lot of questions. There's been a flood of questions during those presentations, and we are going to open the floor to get some of those challenging questions put back to our presenters shortly. But first of all, we would like to invite 3 panel responses. And so, as Martin just introduced, the first of those will be from James Bampton of WWF. He is the Asia Pacific Forest Lead, and I invite you to give your reaction. Over to you, Jim.
Great, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk on this panel. When preparing for this panel session on responsible agricultural investments, I was immediately struck by how good responsible agriculture investment sounds and how necessary it is in the face of today's and tomorrow's fundamental challenges: catastrophic climate change, biodiversity loss, global ill health, and social injustice, and the need to bend the curve of all of these. But let's acknowledge that an unacceptable level of irresponsible agricultural investment continues, and redress or sanctioning of past irresponsibility is not occurring. We have just heard fascinating presentations from companies striving to make responsible agriculture investments. I commend these efforts. And from this, I'm hoping that together we can pick out the motivating factors, because I'd like to understand what might encourage those that are still making irresponsible agricultural investments to change their practices. As has been noted, I work for WWF. As such, my mission is to conserve nature and reduce the most pressing threats to the diversity of life on Earth. Naturally, I'd like companies applying responsible agriculture investment principles to align and contribute to the same mission. Because let's be clear, the world is hurtling towards climate, biodiversity, global health, and social breakdown if humanity continues with business as usual. And that is more irresponsible than responsible agriculture investment, and the associated consumption and waste practices that go far beyond what is our only planetary home can sustain. Now, we've heard that investors and customers are demanding businesses to apply responsible agriculture investment practices. However, these demands come from only segments of the investment pool and product market for the particular commodities in question. Many companies producing and marketing commodities in the Mekong region are also very segmented in terms of the investors and markets they work with. They are not all in classic, free, full and open Keynesian competition for the same finance and markets, but already have investment and market strategies and business relationships that often keep them apart. So if segments of these markets don't demand responsible agriculture investment, what will drive companies to follow the principles and guidelines if they're only voluntary and are perceived by some to bring more costs than benefit? Now, before I consider this question further, I'd like to raise one other issue that any discussion on responsible agriculture investment should include. Who defines and determines what is responsible? Now, it's 35 years since the phrase greenwashing was coined, when companies themselves started making spurious environmental claims that weren't wholly true. At this time, Chevron became notorious for their multi-million advertising campaigns of side projects that cost only a few thousand, that diverted their sustainability claims away from their questionable broader environmental mismanagement. So what I'm more concerned about today is companies making their own claims on their adherence to responsible agriculture investment principles that it is difficult for investors, governments and customers to verify. We have heard from many presenters about the power and importance of independent third-party certification, particularly from the last presentators, to demonstrate their adherence to various aspects of responsible agriculture investment. The Forest Stewardship Council certification of sustainable forest operations is a standout example, not only for the detailed environmental aspects of sustainable forest management, but also for legality issues and community involvement. Independent third-party certification can prevent egregious greenwashing and should be promoted more with investors and customers to increase their demand for it. However, some believe that following responsible agriculture investment principles has associated costs. As many presenters and participants have noticed, savvy businessmen understand how responsible agricultural investment practices can bring efficiencies, enhance sustainability, reduce risks, as well as open up and command higher prices in some market segments. Unfortunately, the starting point for some businesses is that the associated costs will dent the bottom line, and their investors or customers in their segmented value chain will be unwilling to absorb these costs. This is one reason why irresponsible agriculture investment continues to persist within some commodity sectors within the Mekong region. However, there is another reason for continuing irresponsible agriculture investment in the region, The elephant in the room: outright illegality and corruption. Now, when this happens, it distorts the investment and sales markets even further from the ideal Keynesian level playing field of free and open competition. Unless commodity production is free from illegality and corruption, the incentives for responsible agriculture investment will be even lower, especially when the commodities produced with the aid of illegal practices compete at lower cost in market segments where those operating responsibility are also trying to do business. And in which part of commodity producing businesses is illegality and corruption most rampant? That's right, land acquisition, cutting corners on environmental protections, and the laundering of ill-begotten capital from other illegal activity. So, in conclusion, law enforcement to stamp out illegality and corruption is the first and most essential step to encourage the uptake of responsible agricultural investment and starting to level up the playing field for all commodity producers. The next step in leveling up is to remove any subsidies or barriers to entry into different segments to encourage more open markets so all players are exposed to more demanding investors and customers. And this will also incentivize the uptake of responsible agriculture investment further. Consistency in responsible agriculture investment standards and transparency in assessing adherence will increase the faith and acceptance of investors and customers and reduce the likelihood of greenwashing. And this will be enhanced further through the wider adoption of credible and consistent independent third-party certification schemes. And these measures will only move forward if investors and customers everywhere are aware of the importance of and demand verifiable, responsible agriculture investment. Finally, to ensure no backsliding when economic or other pressures disincentivize responsible agricultural investment, governments should be gradually inserting the principles of responsible agriculture investment into legislation that regulates commodity production and ensure a level playing field between countries. And regional bodies such as ASEAN should lead by working with responsible companies to adopt the measures that will make the greatest difference in the short term without causing significant upsets to markets. So I would like to ask what this session's presenters, other panelists, and you, the participants, identify as the main areas where their competitors for land, capital, labor, or markets are not adhering to responsible agriculture investment principles and how they might be gaining an unfair advantage. And therefore, what are the measures that should be taken to address these issues? Thank you.
Excellent, Jim. Thanks very much. A realist assessment, if ever there was one. And yes, leveling up the playing field is an essential precondition to all of these notions of responsible investment that we're talking about. I won't hold this up. I'll hand straight over to Stefano Savi from the Global Platform on Sustainable Rubber, who has a background also with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. So deep experience with the commodities that have perhaps done the most to reshape forest landscapes across Southeast Asia. Stefano, can I invite your reaction, please?
Thank you, Rob, and thank you for the opportunity for you're giving me to comment on this and on the very informative presentations that we've seen today. It's extremely difficult, to be honest, to take the cue from James. I think he's said it all, really. And we've heard today on the importance of responsible investment. We've heard on the importance of responsible production and practices. Maybe what we haven't heard enough on is on responsible purchasing and the price we're putting on commodities. Yeah, and is this price really reflecting the true cost of this commodities production? And I think James touched upon it in his comment just now. We're seeing two sides of the markets. Yeah, we are seeing a side of the market that is taking advantage from sustainable driven demand. Yeah, so we're seeing companies that are, or actually investors first, that are investing on sustainable production. We're seeing companies that are aligning to global sustainability practices and standards and certification, and we're seeing buyers that are demanding sustainable material because these markets and their customers demand so. But one thing that unites all this is that everyone that is doing things sustainably has to pay more, right? We are seeing that investors have to put more resources and invest more capital in identifying sustainable businesses, what to invest on. We are seeing that the producers who have to do things sustainably have to invest more money in doing so, and in reporting and monitoring and evaluating their work towards sustainability. And we're seeing that buyers that are buying sustainably have to pay more money still, yeah, in order to get sustainable products. And what we are seeing is that while this continues, and especially as also James was highlighting before, we see companies going through a journey where maybe in the beginning, and we're talking sometimes about 100, 150 years ago, the practices were not sustainable, and they made profit out of what is considered, as at least today, as unsustainable practices. They're aligning to those sustainability standards due to the maturity of markets, yeah? And the question that we're not asking ourselves is how can we disincentivize, especially new businesses or businesses that are selling to what are sometimes referred as leakage market to continue doing so, yeah? That's very important. And I think one of the reasons of the initiative, multi-stakeholder initiatives that we're seeing coming up in several commodities is actually to put a stop to this. Yeah, we have seen this can take a positive turn. Yeah, we have seen this in certification. In some sectors, the penetration of certification is less than in others. But we are seeing definitely certification as being one tool that is helping so. But also, I do think that we have an opportunity in collaboration in ensuring that we really take advantage of bottlenecks in the supply chain, to leverage on these bottlenecks, to monetize and internalize the cost of the negative externalities that we're seeing in the market. And I'm wondering, this is my question for the panelists, what does it take for you to really abide and aim for the highest possible available standards when we talk about sustainability, sustainable production, and instead of lowering the standard because it costs much, ensuring that we have enough collaboration within your sector to demand that the standards that are required by the customer are being paid for? What do we need to do so? What are the systems that we can put in place? Do we require, for example, a tax for sustainability? Is that the first thing that we should need, yeah, at global level, to really ensure that we make change in time to achieve the sustainable development goals by the timelines that we have all now agreed to put in place together? So that's my cue there for the panelists later, how we can internalize these costs and not hide behind the fact that these standards are too demanding. If we all agree about the standards in terms of principles, then we need to find a way. Where there's a will, there's going to be a way. So what's the way that we need to take to internalize these costs? Thank you, Rob.
Excellent, Stefano. Thank you so much. Okay, without more ado, I'll move on to our third speaker, which is Vicky Bowman, joining us from the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business, an organization focused in its very title on investor responsibility, and former UK ambassador to Myanmar. So we're especially grateful that you can join us today, Vicky. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rob. I'm especially grateful for the internet connection. So I'm joining you from Kalor in Myanmar. And I see that there are plenty of Myanmar participants in this panel, but obviously, as has already been pointed out by U Shui Thane in the presentation, Myanmar hasn't actually featured in the presentations being given. Would it be possible for Chanda to go on mute, please? Thank you very much. So MCRB very much is aligned with the three presentations in terms of using international standards as the main guidance that it gives to companies who are investing in Myanmar, both Myanmar companies and foreign companies, and in particular, IFC performance standards are the ones that we have always found to be most user-friendly for the companies because they're designed for private investment. We've always also referred to ASEAN regional guidelines to the extent they're relevant, and because we always feel it's good to have an Asian element to guidelines so that they don't just look as though they are from the north or the west. We're trying in our work to both influence companies, but we had been trying up until 1st of February also to influence the regulatory framework in Myanmar to align with those international standards, particularly things like land law, environmental impact assessment regulation, including, and we were having a discussion this morning on this, incorporating free, prior and informed consent into the relevant laws. Unfortunately, the coup really has put paid to a lot of very good work that was going on the regulatory framework, including a massive land law reform program, which had just really kicked off towards the end of 2020, and which I think we all hoped would be an open and collaborative discussion going on through the new elected government and involving civil society groups and business. And my centre was trying to coordinate businesses from all sorts of sectors to feed into that, including obviously the agriculture sector. So all of that really has unfortunately come grinding to a halt, and we're now looking rather alarmed at what might be coming down the track when we look at things like investment and permitting in Myanmar. Just though to step back, we as MCRB, although we've done some sector-wide impact assessments on different sectors, oil and gas, mining, tourism, and ICT, we had toyed with but never actually pursued a SWIA, a sector-wide impact assessment in agriculture, although we had done some work on oil palm, which my colleague Inga, who's online, has been involved in. One of the main reasons that we were reluctant to put too much effort into an impact assessment on agriculture was that there were many other people working on this, the Land Core Group, many others on the line, but also it's because of the lack of the international brands and international investors that we felt that we could influence, and also that had leverage to improve good practices. And when you look at investment in agriculture in Myanmar under the statistics from the Myanmar Investment Commission, which are not 100% to be relied on, only 0.5% of investment has been in agriculture over the last 15 years or so. And most of that has actually been in things like food processing. So there has been a real reluctance by investors to invest in agriculture, despite it being the major form of employment for the majority of the population. And as a result, I think Myanmar loses out then on the ability to improve practices and to be part of global supply chains, which actually are focusing on these standards. And instead, what we're having is very much what was just called by Stefano, the leakage market. In other words, the stuff that goes out across the border is untraceable, is largely going into either the Thai or the Chinese market. In the case of rubber, very much the Chinese market. In the case of commodities like maize, which I think will be a growth sector, it's going into the Thai market. And nobody is either helping the farmers to improve the sustainability of their practices or holding anyone along that supply chain to account in terms of, are these products meeting these various international standards, including ASEAN RAI. And sadly, I think that is the way life will continue, because now Myanmar has become once again a no-go zone for investors, both because of the huge political risk, but also of the reputational risk. So Myanmar stakeholders are going to need to work out how are we going to be able to work on improved sustainability of agriculture, reducing deforestation over the coming months, years, depending on how the political scenery changes, because it's unlikely to be coming from the world of Michelin and Firestone investing in and buying rubber from the market, which is what WWF had been hoping for a couple of years ago with a project they were running. We're still very much going to be the leakage country in Myanmar. So what can those on this webinar do to improve that? And if we have to have a question to the panelists, I suppose I would just echo U Shui Thane's question. What is it that is preventing you, had prevented you from coming to Myanmar? And what would encourage you to come to Myanmar and invest responsibly? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky, for that reaction. And we are very glad you were able to get a connection today to be able to provide that as well. And I think that the question that you've just posed, we can just go straight forward with that. Sorry, it's from U Shui Tane in Myanmar. And that was during the presentation by Justin. So Justin, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. The question is, I have a long list of questions here, so I'm not sure exactly which one is being referred to here.
Sorry, it was about Myanmar as why was Myanmar not part of your?
Yes, part of the investment. So, look, I've been with New Forest for a year now. I wasn't there when the assets were acquired. Obviously, there's a certain amount of funds available to acquire assets, and I know that Myanmar is one of the countries within our purview. We'd certainly be interested in an investment there. In fact, our investment manager in Singapore worked in Myanmar for half a decade and has looked for opportunities. And certainly, so it really boils down to, is the opportunity there? You know, is the price right for the asset? Can we implement a project that can be FSC certified, that will hopefully make investors the profits that they're interested in? And can we manage the asset according to our standards? You know, I won't lie. I imagine that you know, the company is risk adverse. Most are, and so right now, you know, the political situation is something that would certainly be considered moving forward. And you know, we'd sort of have to get a feel for what's going to be happening in the coming years. But we're not adverse to the prospect. It just probably the asset probably wasn't the right one. It probably wasn't there historically, and looking forward, if we can overcome that, if we can be certain that those risks are manageable, then we'd be looking there as well.
Thanks, Justin. Okay, I'm going to move on to a question now for Vietnam Rubber Group. And this is coming from Miles Kenny Lazar of the National University of Singapore. So he asks, it has been well documented that Vietnam Rubber Group subsidiaries in Laos have historically been engaged in land grabbing, so acquiring villagers' land without consent or proper compensation. This is a historic trend that's been well studied. How is VRG seeking to redress these past grievances? How are they seeking to overcome the problems that were caused in the past? And this complements a comment from Stuart Ling also. If VRG has improved its business practices since that time, what was the motivation behind the change? What is the motivation to adopt responsible investment practices? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. This is a good opportunity for us to explain more about our activities recently. So you know, recently VRG have many activities to work sustainability and responsible investment, not only in Vietnam, but also in Laos and Cambodia. Now, on our project, a proper development, we receive the land use certificates of local authorities. That means we respect, we compliant on the requirement of legal framework of national or host countries. And to have a more responsible development in our rubber process, we are cooperating with the local authority, but also NGO, relevant NGO, to continue for the social security investment for local people. So that means we would like to improve their livelihood, not only for the workers recruitment, but also for their benefits, social benefits in our project areas. About the respecting laws of countries is the state-owned enterprises. VRG must compliant or respect strictly the legal laws of national of our countries, but also the host countries like in Laos and Vietnam. On the regarding the rights of workers, as we said, we as state-owned companies, we must respect the laws, and there are investment every year of governmental agencies to monitoring, evaluate, and they follow our compliance of the laws. When we why we to work the sustainability and responsible investment in agriculture, particularly in rubber plantation. Firstly, we would like to implement our strategy. VRG already have a commitment 3 years ago, the strategy on sustainable development based on the requirement of our government, but also because we would like to adapt to the requirement of our customers, and also we have the cooperation with NGO to push to promote our sustainable development. And when we receive and we have the community participation or consultation in our responsible investment, we found that it's less the complaint and also the grievance from local peoples. Of course, there are a lot, a little bit higher cost, but we think we can arrange our finance, our budget to do social security investment. So that now we can say that in the rubber region, we have a good or close relationship with the local authorities and also local people. That's I try to have a feedback for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Huan. That was a really detailed response. We appreciate that. There are quite a few questions to try to get around, and we'll do what we can in the remaining time. But I'm just going to raise one now with Jana from FAO, if that's okay. So the question is coming from RRI. It's from Anne-Sophie. And the key aspect of the question is there not a fundamental issue that very large scale monoculture plantation can't by its very nature be considered sustainable?
For the rubber plantation, yes, before we implement as a monoculture, but now according to recent guidelines, technical guidelines of VRG, we change now not only from VRG, but also we have the support from UNDP in Vietnam in the DEDD project. They ask VRG have the technical guidelines on, we call that sustainable natural rubber production. Just last year, and we issued this technical guidelines not only for VRG but also for other companies and particularly for smallholders. So we think in the near future, rubber plantation not monoculture, it should be like agroforestry or diversification of crops on rubber regions.
Thank you, Dr. Hoa. Okay, could I ask Jana to add on to that from the perspective of the ASEAN RAI guidelines? Thank you, Jana.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I saw this very interesting comment also about whether rural communities and traditional farmers should not be regarded as key investors. So actually they are. We know that farmers are the largest investors in on-farm production. And the CFS RAI guidelines on which the ASEAN RAI guidelines are based, they emphasize the role of rural communities and traditional farmers as key investors in agriculture. But of course, the corporate private sector is an important investor as well that can bring in needed capital. So it is also when these investments from the private sector, these large scale investments are irresponsible, that they have the most severe impact. So that is why then the ASEAN RAI focus particularly on how to make these type of investments responsible.
Thanks, Jana. I'd like to just come back to new forests for a moment, if that's okay. It's a question from Rekoff TC. So how does new forests identify legal and customary rights of communities prior to and during operations? Which is part of the principles that were mentioned. And could you also reflect a little more on the legacy issues that were faced by Mekong timber in the Lao context? Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. It's a great question, the first one, because it's quite difficult. You know, governments typically don't recognize customary rights. So in some cases, it can be quite simple by looking at you know, traditional uses of land, clear evidence. You know, in Lao PDR, for example, they've started to ask farmers to pay taxes regularly on land that they're using, and there are various ways that it is being better documented from this point going forward, but it is quite complex. And the best answer I can give you is that through very diligent community consultation, you know, throughout early phases of the project, there's nothing more important than community consultation. And because of our conservation set-asides, being granted a concession area does not mean that we're obligated to plant. And we've been very consistent in identifying what needs to be conservation. And a big part of that is through community engagement, stakeholder consultation. It's much easier to see what should be protected from an environmental standpoint. And it is complex to understand what should be protected from a social and community perspective. But it just, again, the most important tool is just consultation. And legacy issues. Yes, I mean, look, what the first thing that we do actually prior to acquiring an asset is hire consultancies. Well, first we do some of our own initial due diligence, then we hire consultancies to do legal due diligence, to do due diligence pretty much against the IFC performance standards, and a third consultancy to conduct a due diligence assessment against the FSC principles and criteria to make sure that we're comfortable that we can get FSC certified. It's rare that you come across an asset or a potential asset that has no legacy issues. In the case of MTP in the Mekong, there were allegations that needed to be addressed about forest clearance. And so part of that assessment was a detailed look back at the history of land acquisition and what had been cleared. What we found is that the level of clearance was less than that required to obtain FSC certification. So we thought from that standpoint, it was a worthy investment because for forest clearance going forward, we can manage that. What happened historically, unfortunately, any degraded land in Southeast Asia was at some point cleared. We can hold ourselves accountable for everything going forward, and we were comfortable looking back that the level was at an area where we could obtain FSC certification, and we in fact did, and so that ended up being correct. Legacy issues with communities, probably the biggest thing that we found during due diligence was just a lack of communication and engagement with communities, and so we basically re-engaged, and in areas where we found that there was dissatisfaction with previous negotiations around land or unfulfilled promises around compensation, that was addressed in a very transparent manner.
All right, thanks, Justin. There's a whole afternoon's worth of questions here, but unfortunately we do have other items on the agenda that we're going to have to move forwards to. So we'll be making a record of all of these questions and looking at ways that we can continue this discussion. For now, I'll have to hand back to Martin to explain about the breakout sessions. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob, and to all of the speakers. Like Rob said, we are now going to have the breakout sessions, but we will have a short break first, and then the last breakout group discussions will begin at 3:45. Again, those sessions will be under different Zoom links, which you can find on the Huova app or on the event webpage on the Land Portal website. There are 9 breakout sessions this afternoon, and they will discuss the experiences and challenges in applying the right principles in different initiatives at country and regional levels. Now, again, some of these sessions are in local languages, but there is English translation for all the sessions. The breakout sessions will last about 45 minutes, after which you'll have another short break before rejoining the plenary for key takeaways and the closing session. Now, a very important point before you leave, you will need to also log into a new Zoom room for the session on key takeaways and closing. Yesterday, we left the plenary session, this Zoom on while the breakout sessions were going, so some people stayed on, but no, we are going to close this Zoom room, and then for the key takeaways and the closing session will be in a new Zoom link. Again, you can find that link on the Huova app as well as on the event webpage. So see you back at the plenary at 4:45. Thank you. We have Daniel Hayward from the Mekong Land Research Forum, the Regional Center for Social Science and Sustainable Development at the Chiang Mai University, who's going to be doing a summary of the key takeaways and plans for further actions for session 4. Daniel?
Thank you so much, Tin Lai Win. I'm using a new computer today and haven't managed a mic test yet. So I will keep talking and someone can interrupt if there is any issue with the mic volume. Also, I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen for this presentation. So just bear with me a second. Okay. This is partial. We will be getting there soon. Oh, perfect. Good. Actually, this is a slightly unenviable task to give some key takeaways for this session. It suddenly very much felt as if during our panel discussion and questions and answers section that we were really starting to take off into some very interesting debates and discussions, and it, you know, this is a fantastic platform to continue further over a number of days. But unfortunately, I'm going to have to reduce things down a bit here. So apologies if it feels like a rather false fall back to earth. Anyway, to start my summing up, I thought it would be useful to place our problem in the simplest terms once again. And these are very simple problems which have come up time and time again throughout this forum. And I'm going to do it through the lens of our favorite fictional detective, Sherlock Holmes, who always claimed that he judged a case by how many times he would have to smoke his pipe before coming to a solution. So I've placed this as a 3-pipe problem for 3 components. Number one, what we're talking about here for responsible agricultural investments, we're talking about an issue of investor confidence. There are many investors who wish to work with reputable practices, but they've seen multiple investments and business models fail in the region, and so are concerned about their ability to achieve a suitable economic return as well as a maintenance of their corporate reputation. Then we have benefits for smallholders, or rather a lack of benefits. In many cases, smallholders have lost their land or seen it degraded through intensive agricultural practices. And this ties into the third point of achieving environmental sustainability. Now, what is clear is that support is needed for governments, communities, and companies. And this is where we moved into our first presentation from Yana, who I thought provided an excellent overview of looking at the ASEAN RAI guidelines. This was not intentional, but it seems Micah, Ingalls, and I are both thinking in terms of bridges during this forum. And I kind of visualize things in the same way. Now, these guidelines are not one singular vision, but instead they can be seen as a sort of housing of multiple international standards in a form that is geared towards a specific region. And Yana highlighted guidelines 4 and 5, which look at land tenure and forest areas. So there's a very good bridge between identifying these international standards and putting them in a regional framework. But the problem now is the challenge of reaching a national context. So in our further 2 presentations, we then had 2 companies presenting their perspective on, in a way, achieving responsible agricultural investment, although in actuality, neither of them specify their work in these terms. So I'm actually starting with the New Forest presentation, who looked into they provided a case study of eucalyptus and acacia plantations in Lao PDR. And they've got very clear CSR policy in place to look towards international standards like FSC, FPIC, IFC, excuse me for all of these acronyms. And the challenge for them is how they can manage operations at the local level in order to achieve these international standards. And even though they're not directly incorporating the RAI guidelines, I think there is still a very important role that could be played in finding a way to implement these guidelines at the national level and help them support national, subnational, and community actors work with communities, work with companies. Now, in a way, I could put this diagram for Vietnam Rubber Group as well, but I think there's something else quite interesting going on through their presentation, and that there's a sort of a double-edged attack to their work. At one level, they're very much a domestic investor in rubber and other crops in Vietnam. And in this sense, they're looking with CSR policy to engage with government regulation. But this also has to happen in their cross-border ventures in Laos and Cambodia. So there are two ways here that the RAI guidelines could be of some use. I think it's very interesting from the questions that came up. Obviously, in their case, there's a very interesting positioning here. And I think there's demands for everyone to kind of know, how do we relate past practices next to the sort of implementation of new company policies and what these can actually bring to the table. So perhaps now getting to some more meat or in the discussion, some final thoughts. Obviously, there's a lot of strong points through the RAI guidelines, but we are talking about potential here, the potential to address economic, social, and environmental impacts of land-based investments, the potential to assist governments, communities, and companies in order to achieve inclusive and equitable outcomes. I think in particular, we have to make sure that smallholders and the rural poor are included in a meaningful way so that this doesn't become some sort of box ticking exercise. Of course, the companies we've had presenting here have been putting forward their strong interest in CSR. But what about other companies? And in a way, we had some examples of carrot and stick options. I mean, the sort of comments from James Bampton were very clear in wanting to call out continued illegality and corruption. Then on the other hand, we had a sort of false carrot from Stefano Savi in that it would be great to highlight the economic benefits, but then what about the fact that responsible investment costs more from production to consumer? And so he asked the question, how do we internalize some of these costs to make a level playing field and bring in more and encourage more responsible investment? And then as a final point, I think we have to look to the comments of Vicky Bowman, which are also taken up through the question from Ushui Tin about the price of political instability. And in particular, we're looking at the case of Myanmar here. There may be many companies wanting to act in a responsible way, but how can they do so when they're faced with a very uncertain political situation, as we can see in Myanmar? And I think the question from Ushui Tin did highlight many fears that the country is is failing to kind of benefit from the potential of responsible investment. So I think I'm going to leave it there. As a final reminder, please, if you have not already, do go to the Menti website and fill in the code and answer the questions for the second poll today. And we have until 5 o'clock, which I guess is coming up soon. So jump to it. I think that's all from me at the moment. Thank you very much.